Hello, friends, and welcome back to the next installment in How the Gospels Became History, Jesus and Mediterranean Myth. This is a series that is based on my book of the same title, published by Yale University Press in 2019. I'm going chapter by chapter, so I hope all of you will have a chance to look at the previous videos. Let me know what you think. Leave a comment, leave a like if this is helpful. And if you want to ask further questions, join me on Patreon. Today we'll be looking at chapter 7, entitled Magi and the Star. And this follows in the biblical order of Jesus' mythic and myth historical life, and it's one of my personal favorite chapters. For those of you who don't know, around Christmas time on my Patreon I published a video on who were the Magi, in which I go in detail on their background. It's an ambiguous title, as it can typically refer either to a Persian style or Persian priest and to a magician or quack, depending on who's using the term. But in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, verse 1, it does seem to be the case that we're dealing with a distinctly Persian group of magi. They weren't kings, but they were astrologers. And they had, according to Matthew, a very interesting encounter with a star. Now, the author of Matthew is famous for setting his tale in the context of an Old Testament set of verses and type scenes, and he's constantly reminding you that Jesus is fulfilling prophecies from the Hebrew Bible. All this is well and good, but these are the resonances that are easy to catch. There are resonances that are not so easy to catch because we are divorced from the historiography of the ancient world. We typically don't know Herodotus. We don't know the political events that were occurring around Jesus' life. We don't know all the famous kings that they did. In fact, probably the only king that most people know of today is King Charles. So there's a lot of other resonances that ancient readers would have picked up on when reading the account of Matthew. And it suffices for me as we go through simply to note places where there are other magi in other historia or historiographical works of antiquity. And one of the best places to stop is Herodotus. And Herodotus was interested in Persia, and he told the story of the king Astyages and his encounter with the Magi. According to this account, Astyages had a dream. His granddaughter made water, that is, she urinated, and it filled the entire globe. He was highly disturbed by this dream, but he went to bed and had another dream in which he saw a vine grow out from between his granddaughter's legs and cover the entire earth. He got up, he was very disturbed, called the Magi, and they informed him that his descendant would become king and rule over the known world. Well, Astyages didn't want to be replaced, so he ordered that his granddaughter's baby boy be seized and killed. And he gave that commission to his trusty advisor, Harpagus. And Harpagus went and took the baby, and he then gave it to a local shepherd on the king's staff. The shepherd was ordered to expose the baby on the far mountains. It turns out that the shepherd's wife had just given birth to a stillborn child, and she took one look at the living baby and decided that she must have it as her own. So apart from the knowledge of Harpagus, shepherd and his wife exchanged the babies, delivering the dead one to the mountains. And so it was that the young boy grew up and became Cyrus the Great, the greatest king Persia had ever known. Now, what's interesting about this tale is not that it overlaps in sequence or part by part with what we find in Matthew, but that it includes several similar type scenes that could fit into ancient history. And some of these include the death of an infant king or the attempt to kill an infant king, a king disturbed by a report, a king interacting with Magi knowing the future. This is all part of the background of Matthew's story. It's likely that in his day, the story of the Magi and Astyages was much better known. So as Matthew sat down to rewrite a tale of a king interacting with Magi who know the future, this story may well have provided a kind of background or launchpad. But my point is that both stories could be found in works that the ancients considered historia, that is, historiographical writings. They weren't considered myths in our sense, unbelievable tales. They were presented as historical tales, even though they contained fantastical elements. There were other stories of Magi well known to people in antiquity, and these in particular dealt with the king Alexander the Great. It was said that on the night of Alexander the Great's birth, the huge and magnificent temple to Artemis of the Ephesians burnt to the ground. The Persians held Ephesus at the time, and so it was no surprise that Persian priests or magi dwelled in the city. And as the temple burned, they ran amok in the streets, beating their faces, and they could be heard crying out that all of Asia would be taken and destroyed. And of course, some 30 years later, it was taken from the Persians by Alexander the Great himself. There are other encounters of Alexander with Magi. When he comes into Babylon, he is met by Magi. And these Magi know that when Alexander comes into Babylon, he will perish. According to the historian Pompeius Trogus, we hear this tale, quote, "In both the year in which he was born, and in the year in which he began to reign, a long-haired star shone for 70 days, so that the entire sky seemed to blaze." Unquote. Now, who is this report about, and why would it appear in a work of ancient history? Especially because this astral phenomenon was very strange. Pompeius Trogus says that this particular star, long-haired star, which we know as a comet, lit up a quarter of the sky. This was no normal star. And what it predicted was no normal prediction. Most people in the ancient world knew that the king of whom Pompeius spoke was Mithridates VI, no longer a household name by any means. This king was immensely important as one of the last of Rome's great enemies, who was able to beat Rome on the battlefield, at least temporarily. Mithridates took over the entire landmass of what we now call Turkey, or what is called Asia Minor. He was a king of Pontus, and it was said that on the day of his birth and the day he began to reign, a star was seen. And this star can still be seen on his coins. It was an immensely important event, and it showed forth victory for Mithridates and loss for the Romans. Stars such as these could indicate disaster for some or victory for others. They were, in essence, ambiguous signs.
Now, close readers of Matthew will know that the star which the Magi saw was no ordinary star. After their encounter with Herod, this star was said to go ahead, proagon in the Greek, in Matthew 2:9. The star literally advances ahead of the Magi, moves in the sky, and is low enough in the sky and small enough to settle over the house in which the infant Jesus is staying. This is certainly no normal astral phenomenon. And so it would be vain for astrologers and students of ancient astrology to try to identify the conjunction or the comet or whatever astral phenomenon is actually recorded in the Gospels. The fact is, it isn't actually an astral phenomenon. It is a low star of some sort in the lower atmosphere, not above the stratosphere. Otherwise, we can't explain how it could rest above the single house of Jesus. It just doesn't make any sense. To the ancients, it's very likely that this particular star would have been interpreted as an angel. And in fact, that is exactly what is later said in Christian literature. So we have this, certainly from a modern perspective, somewhat weird, fantastical tale about a star which isn't really like any other star. But could such a story fit within the genre of ancient historiography? Well, I think it can. If you look at an account of Plutarch, who is an ancient historian, tells us about the torch of Timoleon. Now, Timoleon was a Corinthian general who went on an expedition to Italy. And it was said that his fleet was guided by a star that lit their way in the night and then descended exactly where Timoleon and his fleet were meant to land, on western shores. That's in ancient Historia. That's not a myth or mythos. We also have the example of Varro's Venus. Varro was an ancient historian and scholar of the 1st century BCE in Rome. And he tells us of the tradition that Venus, who is Aeneas's mother, guided her son in astral form as he moved westward from the city of Troy to Italy and helped him to land on the same western shores so that he knew he was divinely guided. This didn't end up in Virgil's Aeneid. It was told by a historian as a tradition. And so even these somewhat fantastical elements could indeed make it into a genre that the ancients considered historiographical. Thus ends our tale, and thus ends this particular chapter in how the Gospels became history. It is only the tip of the iceberg, only a superficial summary. For those who want to go deeper, who want to see my notes, see the suggested reading, see the details of the things that I've been telling you, go get the book, read it along with this series, and deepen your knowledge of the ancient world, and in particular, of the Gospels. Read them in a way that you never have read them before. I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody for coming along and having a listen. I hope that you've benefited. If you have, please leave a like and a comment. Consider supporting me on Patreon. There I can answer your questions and offer you book deals and other perks. I really appreciate everybody's support. I wish you well and take care.